All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the longest U.S. war of the 20th century. This was a deeply complex proxy conflict that completely fractured nations, divided the global public, and honestly changed the world forever. Set against the incredibly tense backdrop of the global Cold War, where the United States and the Soviet Union were basically vying for absolute supremacy, this war left millions dead and fundamentally altered how citizens view their own governments. It's a massive, controversial, and often deeply misunderstood chapter of history. Make sense of all this chaotic history, we've broken this explainer down into 6 parts. First, we'll look at the origins of the conflict. Second, the American escalation. Third, tactics in the jungle. Fourth, the turning point. Fifth, withdrawal and defeat. Finally, the legacy of the war. Let's get into it. Starting us off with Section 1, Origins of the Conflict. We're looking at French Indochina and beyond. It's wild, the roots of this whole thing actually started way before the US ever sent a single ground troop. It traces all the way back to the end of World War II. See, Vietnam had been a French colony for decades, but the people there, they were totally exhausted by foreign rule and fiercely wanted their independence. So Ho Chi Minh's communist forces, the Viet Minh, they fought off European colonial rule during this grueling 8-year conflict called the First Indochina War. In 1954, the French suffered this massive, totally crushing defeat at Dien Bien Phu. Right after that, global powers met up in Geneva and decided to temporarily split the country at the 17th parallel. But, as often happens, that temporary split quickly hardened into a permanent border, artificially creating a communist north led by Ho Chi Minh and a capitalist south backed by Western powers. So why the massive U.S. involvement? Well, presidents like Dwight Eisenhower were absolutely terrified of this concept called the domino theory. Because the Soviet Union and China were actively backing the North Vietnamese, American leaders pictured global geopolitics literally like a row of dominoes. They firmly believed that if South Vietnam fell to communism, all of neighboring Asia was just going to inevitably fall right behind it. Driven by this Cold War policy of containment, the United States felt absolutely obligated to prop up the South Vietnamese government. And this was even though its leaders were, frankly, incredibly corrupt and deeply unpopular with their own citizens. All right, moving right along to Section 2, the American escalation. Let's see how we went from just advisors to a full-on war. The conflict steadily snowballed from just financial aid and military advisors under President Kennedy into a full-blown, catastrophic ground war under President Lyndon B. Johnson. And the spark for this explosion in military power? That was the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964. On August 2nd, the USS Maddox exchanged fire with North Vietnamese boats. But what followed is honestly pretty shocking. A reported second attack on August 4th actually never happened. The sailors thought they were under attack in the dark, but they weren't. Regardless, based on that false report, Congress passed a resolution giving Johnson the unprecedented power to take any military action necessary without a formal declaration of war. I mean, it was literally a blank check for war. Just to put that into perspective, between 1965 and 1968, American troop numbers absolutely exploded, swelling to over 500,000 soldiers deployed in Vietnam. And to fill those massive ranks, the military relied heavily on a deeply unpopular draft system. Nearly 1.9 million men were drafted. And the catch? The system profoundly and disproportionately targeted poor, working class, and minority men. Meanwhile, the wealthy and well-connected frequently found college deferments or medical loopholes to get out of serving. This undeniable class divide would really quickly lay the fiery groundwork for a massive domestic anti-war movement. Okay. Let's shift gears to Section Tactics in the Jungle. This was a completely new kind of war. Ho Chi Minh once delivered this really stark promise to the French, and honestly, it applied just as easily to the Americans later on. He said, "You will kill 10 of our men, and we will kill 1 of yours, but in the end, you will tire of it first." The United States went in, assuming their vastly superior technology and overwhelming firepower would basically guarantee a quick victory. But they fundamentally underestimated the absolute unyielding of an enemy fighting a war of national survival. The contrast between the two sides was just staggering. The U.S. military, fighting alongside the South Vietnamese army, relied heavily on traditional firepower tactics. We're talking flying in on helicopters, drop in 800 tons of bombs every single day, and spraying toxic herbicides like Agent Orange just to strip away the dense jungle cover. In stark contrast to that, they were fighting the official North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong guerrillas in the south, who were using this incredibly resilient, stealthy warfare. They built literal miles of elaborate underground tunnels to survive the relentless bombings, laid brutal booby traps out in the jungle, and kept their forces constantly supplied using the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was this secret, shifting network stretching right through neighboring neutral Laos and Cambodia. And that brings us to Section 4, Turning Point, the Tet Offensive. Picture this. It's January 31st, 1968. It's the Vietnamese New Year, a time when a ceasefire was generally expected. Out of nowhere, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese launched this shockingly coordinated surprise attack across dozens of provincial capitals all at once. I mean, even the heavily fortified U.S. Embassy in Saigon was... Now, the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces did ultimately repel this massive attack militarily, but the psychological damage, that was permanent. U.S. military leaders had just been assuring the American public that the enemy was weak and basically on the verge of total collapse. The sheer scale of the Tet Offensive completely shattered that illusion, proving the enemy was nowhere near defeat. Back home, public trust completely evaporated. Nightmare realities were being broadcast right into living rooms every single night, making this history's first truly televised war. Adding to all that horror was the exposure of the My Lai massacre, a brutal atrocity where hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians were murdered by U.S. troops. It deeply scarred the global conscience. And then came the bombshell leak of the Pentagon Papers. We're talking thousands of pages of classified documents proving that successive administrations had secretly expanded the war and actively lied to the public for years. Driven by these crazy revelations in that unequal draft we talked about, massive campus protests erupted across the country. It fundamentally tore American society apart. Let's move into Section 5, Withdrawal and Defeat. The painful road to the fall of Saigon. Seeking an end to the chaos, Richard Nixon wins the presidency, promising an honorable exit. He starts promoting this policy called Vietnamization, the strategy of gradually withdrawing American troops and handing the ground combat responsibilities over to the South Vietnamese army to defend their own land. But there was a massive, glaring contradiction at play here. While publicly promising peace, Nixon secretly expanded massive bombing campaigns into neighboring Cambodia and Laos to cut off that Ho Chi Minh Trail, and he did this entirely without the knowledge or approval of Congress. Naturally, this only sparked even more intense outrage and fiery protests when the truth finally leaked out to the public. Tracing the timeline to the end, in early 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were finally signed. This allowed U.S. forces to leave and prisoners of war to return home. But honestly, the peace was a fleeting illusion. Without American military backing, South Vietnam was incredibly vulnerable. Just 2 years later, the North Vietnamese launched a massive final offensive. By April 1975, the whole world watched those desperate, chaotic helicopter evacuations from the U.S. Embassy roof as Saigon fell. South Vietnam was quickly overrun, permanently erased from the map, and fully absorbed into a reunified communist nation. Finally, Section 6, the legacy of the war. The lasting trauma. When you actually look at the raw data, the human loss of this conflict is absolutely staggering. While over 58,000 Americans died, the devastation in Southeast Asia was practically apocalyptic. Over 1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters perished in the jungle. But the most heartbreaking stat of all has to be the civilian toll. Over 2 million innocent civilians were caught in the crossfire of this proxy war, losing their lives to bombings, crossfire, and the complete destruction of their homes and villages. And the ripples of this war, they were deeply toxic and far-reaching. American veterans returned home not to parades, but to a deeply divided nation. They frequently faced hostility and a severe lack of mental health support for the profound PTSD they were suffering from. This ushered in what's known as Vietnam Syndrome, a deep American hesitation to ever commit ground troops abroad again. Environmentally, 19 million gallons of Agent Orange poisoned the landscape, causing horrific cancer spikes and birth defects that are literally still happening today. Domestically, the war pushed the U.S. to lower the voting age to 18. And geopolitically, those secret bombings destabilized Cambodia so severely it paved the way for the ruthless Khmer Rouge regime, resulting in a horrific genocide of up to 3 million more people. So I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought. Considering everything we just explored in this explainer, the shifting justifications, the millions of lives lost, the massive environmental devastation, and the reality that despite all of it, Vietnam still reunited under communist rule, when, if ever, is the unimaginable cost of a proxy war truly justified? Think about how the shadows of this incredibly complex history continue to influence the decisions our world leaders make today.